She wasn't there to campaign. She wasn't there to give a speech. Karoline Leavitt walked into that quiet, empty church because something bigger than politics had pulled her in. No cameras, no microphones. Just a young woman kneeling before the altar and hearing a voice that would change her life forever. A voice that didn't speak through headlines or applause, but through stillness, conviction, and the love of Jesus Christ. In a moment of total surrender, Karoline heard 6 words that shook her to her core. "You were made for more, Karoline." What happened next would bring a rising star in American politics to her knees and lift up a message that could inspire millions. This isn't just a story, it's a testimony. If you believe God still speaks, still calls people in high places to walk humbly, serve boldly, and live by truth, like this video and subscribe. Because the world needs more voices like Karoline's, and your faith is part of this mission. The old white chapel stood on the edge of a quiet New Hampshire town, its steeple piercing the clouds like a sentinel watching over the weary. It was the kind of church that looked like it hadn't changed in 80 years. White paint chipped by seasons, iron bell hanging silent in the tower, and doors so heavy they sighed when pushed open. That day, it was silent, empty, still. And then the door creaked. Karoline Leavitt stood in the doorway, her hand still pressed against the weathered wood. The weight of the day had followed her in, the endless headlines, the noise of politics, the social media scrutiny, the pressure of being the youngest woman in the game. And for a long moment, she just breathed. Not the kind of breath you take between meetings, but the kind of breath you take when your soul is on the edge and only silence can catch it. She didn't plan to be here. Not this church. Not today. She'd been driving through town, alone, thinking about how disconnected everything had started to feel. The speeches were starting to sound the same. The fire that once burned in her when she spoke about faith, family, and America, it was flickering, not out, but dim. "I need clarity," she whispered to no one. And without planning it, she had turned her car into the lot of this little white church, stepped out, and walked up the steps like her feet were being pulled by something not of this world. Now she was inside, surrounded by soft light filtering through stained glass windows. The air smelled of old wood and wax. Her heels clicked gently on the stone floor as she made her way down the center aisle. She hadn't been here in years, not this exact church, but this place, a holy place, a quiet place, a listening place. She passed the pews slowly, tracing her fingers along the back of each wooden bench. The echoes of past prayers seemed to whisper through the space, old saints and grandmothers whose words once rose up like incense now resting in the still air. At the front stood the crucifix, the figure of Christ carved in old wood, arms open wide. But this time, as her eyes met his, something stopped her. She wasn't looking at a statue. She was looking into truth. Karoline stepped into a pew and knelt. Her hands trembled slightly as they folded. Her heart felt heavy, not with guilt, but with fatigue. Not from sin, but from trying so hard to do the right thing in a world that often rewarded the opposite. And that's when she heard it. A voice, not from behind, not from within, not a thought, not an echo. A voice, not loud, not forceful, but unmistakable. "Why do you doubt?" She didn't move, couldn't. It wasn't the kind of fear you get from danger. It was the kind of fear Moses must have felt when the bush burned, and he knew he was standing on holy ground. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. "Why do you doubt?" the voice said again, gentle yet with a power that vibrated through her chest. Tears filled her eyes. "I don't know anymore," she whispered. I've been trying so hard, but everything feels like it's slipping away." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was expectant. "You were made for more than applause." She gasped. Those words cut deep, like a scalpel to the ego, but also a salve to the soul. In that moment, everything made sense. The weariness, the pressure, the disillusionment. She had gotten caught in the spotlight and lost the source of her light. Karoline buried her face in her hands, and for the first time in years, she cried. Not the tears you cry in private when no one's watching, but the tears you cry in the presence of something greater. "I don't want to lose myself," she said through sobs. "I don't want to forget why I started this." "Then come back." The voice wasn't asking, it was inviting. Come back to the one who called you. She looked up again at the crucifix. And this time, it wasn't just wood and nails, it was love, pure, undeniable, fierce. I've said your name on stages, she said. I've quoted your words on debate floors, but I forgot to listen. I forgot to come to you first. A warmth spread through her chest. Not emotional, not metaphorical. Physical, like a fire had been lit inside her. She reached into her bag and pulled out the Bible her grandmother had given her when she graduated college. The leather cover was worn from years of travel. She hadn't opened it in months. But now, as her fingers flipped through the pages, they stopped, right at Psalm 46. Be still and know that I am God. Karolina smiled through the tears. Okay, she whispered, I'm still. And in that moment, everything changed. She sat there in the quiet, motionless, not in fear, but in awe. The kind of stillness that makes the soul stop spinning, like the moment after a storm when the wind finally dies and the world feels raw and alive all at once. Karoline's heart thudded in her chest, but everything else had quieted. The voice still echoed inside her. You were made for more than applause. Those words struck her deeper than any political critique, deeper than any praise she'd ever received. They touched something no camera could capture. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like the youngest press secretary in American history. She didn't feel like a public figure. She felt like a daughter. She closed her eyes again, and without trying to force it, she whispered softly, What do you want from me? No answer, not yet. But then, a memory came. Not one she had been thinking about, but one that came rushing back on its own. Her grandfather's church when she was a child. Sitting on his knee during worship, hearing him hum old hymns she didn't understand. One day, he had said, God will speak to you, and when he does, you'll know. You won't hear him with your ears, but with your life. She gasped. The memory wasn't just nostalgia, it was prophecy. I'm listening, she said, louder this time. Then it began. The light in the church dimmed, but not from sunset. The stained glass windows seemed to fade, as if the entire church had exhaled and released her into another space, like stepping out of time. Karoline felt her knees press into the pew cushion, but suddenly the church floor felt distant, like she was somewhere else, somewhere in between the seen and unseen. And then the vision began. Not a dream, not a thought, but a vision. It started with faces. A mother holding her child in a hospital room, whispering prayers over IV tubes. A teacher in a public school, pausing before class to bow his head silently, asking for strength. A small-town pastor preaching to a half-empty room, still opening his Bible with reverence. Then the images changed. A politician giving a speech filled with half-truths. A boardroom filled with applause for an agenda soaked in compromise. And then Karoline herself, standing on a stage, saying all the right things, getting cheers, holding a Bible, but not feeling its weight. She saw it, clear as crystal. She had started with a mission, but somewhere along the way, the mission had become a performance. And in the presence of that truth, she fell forward, face to the ground in the vision, tears streaming as the warmth returned. This isn't to shame you, the voice said gently. This is to free you. Free me from what? She asked. From believing that they define your worth, from the lie that success means surrendering your soul, from the fear that if you stop performing, you'll be forgotten. Her chest heaved, her body shook, because she knew it was true. She had chased approval like it was oxygen. Then the voice spoke again. Do you want your name to be known, or my name to be lifted? It wasn't condemnation, it was correction. I want to lift yours, she said, but I'm scared. Then give me your fear. In the vision, she opened her hands, and for the first time, she felt the weight she'd been carrying all these years. Fear of irrelevance, fear of failing her family, fear of losing the spotlight, fear of being misunderstood by the very people who once praised her. She lifted it all, trembling, and the moment she did, the warmth rushed in again, like a flood. Suddenly she was back in the church, kneeling, breathing heavily, heart pounding. And then, finally, the voice returned, not distant or divine now, but close, like a friend leaning in, whispering truth. You will speak again, but not as the girl with a mic, as the woman I have called. Karoline sat back slowly, wiping her eyes. Her hand touched the pew beside her, and for a moment, she remembered the first time she stood on a stage as a teenager, shaking, unsure, but believing in something bigger than herself. That's the girl God had found again. And this time, she wasn't going back to the old ways. This time, she was walking into something new. The light returned slowly, and the familiar walls of the church embraced her like an old friend. But Karoline didn't move. She stayed there, eyes closed, breathing slowly, the weight of what she had just seen still pressing gently against her soul. Her palms were still open, her heart still soft. Everything was quiet, but nothing felt empty. "You will speak again," the voice had said. She opened her eyes. The church hadn't changed, but something inside her had. She stood carefully, slowly, as if afraid to disturb the holiness still lingering in the air. The silence wasn't oppressive, it was sacred. Karoline walked toward the front of the sanctuary, not out of obligation, but out of reverence. Her heels barely made a sound now. She stopped before the altar. The old wooden cross that had once been just a symbol now felt alive. She knelt again. This time, not to ask, not to beg, but to surrender. A tear slipped from her cheek and landed on the wood. "Okay," she whispered, "then let it be you they see, not me." And that's when it happened. The light in the stained glass window above the altar shifted. It wasn't just the sun, it was something else, like heaven opened just enough to whisper, "We hear you." Karoline closed her eyes and let the warmth pour in again. This time, it wasn't just personal, it was a commission. The vision wasn't over, it was beginning. She felt herself being lifted, not physically, but in her spirit. Suddenly she was standing, not in the church, but in front of a sea of faces, an auditorium. No, a stadium. Crowds as far as her eyes could see. She wasn't dressed in campaign red or stage-ready blue. She wore white, simple, pure, unbranded. Her voice wasn't booming with rhetoric. It was gentle, anchored in truth. She saw herself speaking, not to earn applause, but to awaken hearts, not to tear down her enemies, but to call home the weary. The people listening weren't voters. They were souls. People who had lost their way, lost their families, lost their faith. And now were listening with tears streaming down their faces because they recognized something in her voice they hadn't heard in years. Hope. And then she heard herself saying it in the vision. "God spoke to me, and if he can reach me in the middle of my pride, in the middle of my performance, he can reach you in the middle of your pain." And the people responded, not with cheers, but with stillness, like the entire nation had stopped for a moment to listen. When the vision faded, Karoline found herself back in the pew, stunned. Tears soaked her blouse. She felt drained, and yet more alive than she had ever been. She put a hand on her chest. "Is this really what you're calling me to?" she whispered. A pause. Then a presence, not audible this time, but deeply felt. "Yes." She exhaled, not in fear, but in release. The next few minutes were spent in complete silence. She didn't know what to say. She didn't need to. Sometimes, the best response to God's voice isn't another voice. It's stillness. It's obedience. When she finally stood again, the entire church looked different. Not brighter, not cleaner, just sacred, like it had been waiting for this moment just as long as she had. She took one step toward the back, then another, and that's when she saw the Bible. It was sitting on the last pew, tucked between a hymnal and an old church bulletin. She hadn't seen it when she walked in. Maybe it had been there, maybe it hadn't. She picked it up. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed. Inside, a name, handwritten. Margaret Leavitt, her grandmother. Karoline sat down, her legs trembling. She opened the Bible and found underlined passages, notes scribbled in the margins. Next to Psalm 91, the ink was darker. "He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge." She remembered her grandmother praying those words when Karoline was just a child, scared of the world and what it might take from her. But now, she wasn't scared. She was called, and she was ready to walk forward. Karoline sat on the edge of the pew, her grandmother's Bible clutched to her chest, its faded leather still warm from her touch. The world outside the stained glass windows kept spinning, but inside this little church, time stood still. She wasn't thinking about what she had to do next. She wasn't thinking about her campaign, her inbox, or tomorrow's schedule. In that moment, all she knew was this: she had surrendered. And it wasn't the kind of surrender that comes from defeat. It was the kind that births purpose. The kind that shakes the dust off your soul and says, get back up, but this time, don't walk alone. Karoline looked back up at the altar. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was performing for God, like he was someone to impress, to please, to earn love from. She knew now. He had loved her long before she had ever stepped onto a stage. A breeze passed through the sanctuary, soft but certain. The old chandeliers swayed just slightly above. She took it not as coincidence, but confirmation. I give it all to you, she whispered. The future, the fight, the fear, all of it. She stood slowly and walked to the pulpit. There was no one in the pews, no one watching, no reporters, no critics. But she placed her hands on the edge of the pulpit anyway. And then she spoke, not loudly, not in a shout, but in a calm voice that carried all the strength of surrender. If you still want to use me, she said, then I'm here, all of me. And then she smiled, because she already knew the answer. She left the church a different woman than the one who had entered it. She had walked in with doubt and fatigue, the weight of public life pressing against her shoulders. But now, her back was straight, her stride firm. She had been called, not by a party, not by a movement, but by God. She stepped outside into the crisp evening air. The sun was dipping low behind the pines, and the church bell above her let out a soft, solitary clang, as if heaven itself was acknowledging the shift. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. Messages, notifications, missed calls, but none of them mattered right now. What mattered was what she had just heard in that sanctuary. What mattered was what God had placed on her heart. She tapped the Notes app and began typing a sentence. Then she paused. Her fingers hovered. This moment wasn't for her campaign. It wasn't for the media. It was for the people. Today I heard the voice of Jesus. He told me I'd forgotten why I began, but he also told me he's not finished with me yet. She hit save, not send. Some things weren't meant for broadcast. Not yet. That night, she sat on the front porch of her home, the New Hampshire air biting at her skin, but not enough to drive her inside. Her husband stepped out with a blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. You okay? He asked. She looked up at him with tearful eyes, not sad, but full. I think I'm better than I've ever been, she said. And then she told him everything. The voice, the vision, the cross, the Bible, her grandmother's handwriting, the pulpit, the surrender. He listened without interrupting. And when she finished, he took her hand in both of his and said, Then you know what you have to do now. She nodded. She knew, and she wasn't afraid. The next morning, she woke before sunrise. She opened her grandmother's Bible and flipped to the passage marked with a bent corner. It was Isaiah 6. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, send me. Tears streamed down her cheeks. But she wasn't weeping for herself. She was weeping for the people she was about to reach, the lives God was about to touch through her story. She reached again for her phone. This time, she opened the camera. She pressed record. Her voice was steady, calm, and without pretense. Hi everyone, I wasn't planning to post this. I didn't even plan to be where I was yesterday, but I need to tell you something real. I need to tell you that Jesus spoke to me, not out loud, not like a sound, but like a fire in my chest. A truth I couldn't shake. She paused, then smiled. And he reminded me who I am, not as a politician, not as a speaker, but as his. And I want you to know, he's speaking to you too. If you've ever felt alone, abandoned, or like your voice doesn't matter, he hears you, and he's not done with you either. She stopped the recording, watched it once. Then she posted it. Within 10 minutes, her phone buzzed with replies, but Karoline didn't need affirmation. She had already heard the only affirmation that mattered. You will speak again. And this time, it would be for him. The video Karoline posted that morning didn't just resonate, it ignited. Thousands of comments flooded in within hours. Some were skeptical, some curious, but many, so many, were from people who had been waiting to hear something that finally made them feel less alone. I've been doubting my faith. Your words gave me hope. My daughter sent this to me. I haven't prayed in years, but I just did. This wasn't just a message, it was a lifeline. Karoline read every comment, not because she needed praise, but because she had prayed for this very thing, not for influence, but for impact. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, not restless, but alive. God had said she would speak again, and now people were listening. The next morning, she drove back to that little white church. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. No staff, no camera crew, no press. Just her and God. She opened the heavy doors, stepped inside, and walked directly to the pulpit again. And for the first time, she imagined it not as a stage, but as an altar. She sat down in the front pew and opened her grandmother's Bible. Pages fluttered until they landed in the Gospel of John, chapter 21. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. The words struck her like thunder. Feed my sheep. Her calling wasn't just to speak. It was to nourish, to serve, to guide. Not for power, but for people. She wiped a tear and nodded. Okay, Lord, I'll do it. 2 weeks later, she spoke at a local church. No podium, no campaign branding, just Karoline and her story. She stood in front of the congregation, lights dim, pews full. I didn't come here with a political speech, she said. I came here with a confession. She told them everything, the burnout, the ambition, the moment she walked into that church, the voice she heard, the surrender, the vision, the Bible, the cross, and how Jesus had met her, not in her success, but in her silence. You could hear a pin drop, not out of boredom, but out of reverence, because people weren't just hearing her story. They were seeing their story too. After the service, they lined up for over an hour just to talk to her, not about politics, but about faith, marriage, prayer, doubt, loss. Karoline listened to every word. And when she laid hands on an elderly woman in a wheelchair and prayed with her as the woman cried, a pastor standing nearby whispered to himself, "She's not running a campaign anymore. She's walking in her calling." In the months that followed, Karoline still spoke at events, still gave interviews, still held rallies. But there was a difference now. Every time she stood to speak, she first prayed, "Let it be you they hear, Lord, not me." She quoted scripture more. She mentioned Jesus boldly, and when someone told her to tone it down, she smiled kindly and said, "I don't speak for crowds anymore. I speak for the one who called me." And something remarkable began to happen. People didn't just listen. They wept. Men who hadn't been in church in decades came back. Teenagers caught in anxiety and addiction reached out, saying, "Your video gave me hope." Veterans said they'd lost their will to live until her message reminded them that God still sees them. Her voice had become a vessel. Late one night, after speaking at a faith gathering in Georgia, Karoline sat alone in her hotel room. The room was quiet, the glow from a single lamp stretching across her journal. She opened it and wrote in large, capital letters, "If you're still breathing, you're still called." And beneath it, "Jesus didn't just give me a message, he gave me a mission." She closed the journal, folded her hands, and prayed, "Lord, use my voice for your glory. Use my scars to reach the hurting. Use my surrender to show others how to lay it all down, and let them see you, not me." She turned off the lamp and slept in peace. This wasn't just Karoline's comeback. It was her commission. She hadn't just rediscovered her voice. She had finally learned who it belonged to. So if you've ever wondered whether God still speaks, whether he still moves, whether he still calls people in the chaos of this modern world, look no further. He spoke to Karoline, and he's speaking to you too. So pause, listen, and when he calls your name, say what Karoline said. "Here I am, send me." And now, if Karoline's story moved you, leave a comment saying, "Here I am." Subscribe to our channel for more faith-filled stories of hope and calling. Share this message with someone who needs to be reminded God still speaks, and he's not done with them yet.